Yes, David Tadier.
Thank you, sir. First of all, it's not clear whether or not we'll end up all being able to debate this proposition or whether we will be left with an amended version. But what is certain is that we can at least hear what I'm proposing and before moving on to the consideration of the amendments. And I'll get round to that in a moment. First of all, I'd like to set the tone of this debate, and I will address that in my opening few remarks. But what I want to do initially is just to thank Deputy Gorst and his officers for the way in which I think they've engaged constructively in this, what I think is a debate of fundamental importance. And I will also address why I think it's important that we have this debate and don't shy away from it in due course. And just because I won't be accepting many of the amendments that have been put forward by Deputy Gorst, it doesn't mean that I don't think we're both working for essentially one common good, which is to see an end to violence as soon as possible so that there isn't any more unnecessary suffering and death in the region that we're talking about. And my opening remarks are really that there are no winners in this war. So from the very beginning of the debate, I think the tone and the focus of this debate needs to be and stay where it should be. And that is on the innocent civilians who are losing their lives and who are being seriously injured. And it needs to be with those innocent civilians and who are being injured in their hundreds and thousands because of what has become, and in fact has been, an attritional conflict, not just in the last few months, but actually for many decades. And as we know, in these kind of attritional conflicts, it's always the ordinary people who suffer, and in particular, it's the women and children who often suffer the most. My second point is that this proposition is not about taking sides. But again, if there is a side to take, it's the side of civilians, the side of peace, and the side of hope in a situation where there is, at the moment, it seems, just violence, destruction, and fear. More importantly, I'm not here to prove that one side is better than the other, or that one side is doing much worse things than the other side. And I don't want the debate to be about members simply saying, well, one side did this, one side has done that, and listing what we are entitled to do, but listing what might just be gratuitous examples that may end up creating more heat than light. This brings me to the opening statement for Part A. I'm pleased that we can at least start this debate with consensus. And let's read it, because both Deputy Gorst and I have agreed the following wording. We will agree it shortly, actually, in the amendment. But to express our profound sadness and dismay at the extent of loss of civilian lives in Gaza, and to condemn the taking of hostages and all acts of aggression which violate international law and result in death and harm to civilians, especially women and children. I hope that is an opening statement that we can all agree with. And I would emphasize that the wording has been very carefully chosen and agreed upon to make sure that not one side is singled out, but that we condemn all acts that would violate international law and result in death and harm to civilians. This is important because we've been lobbied hard on this issue. I don't have a problem, incidentally, with being lobbied. I don't have a problem with those emails, and I think we should encourage those emails, because I prefer those kind of approaches to certain other kind of approaches which we might be otherwise receiving in this impassioned area. And I think we understand that passions do get high, but it's important that we as parliamentarians bring this back down to the issues, and more importantly, the issues that we think we might be able to at least contribute to moving things forward. So we as an Assembly are able to start this debate with a united position. We condemn all wrongdoing, whoever and wherever it is being perpetrated, and this is a good start. And ultimately, all of these acts, I hope, will need to be accounted for in accordance with international law. And that won't be us that's doing that, but I hope that those who have committed potential acts of atrocities will be held to account, whoever they are and wherever they've been done. I think it's important at this point to consider our position as a parliament and as an assembly, because I think we're quite lucky. I think we've seen a scenario to the north where a similar ceasefire was being called for, or that parliament was grappling in the House of Commons to have some kind of meaningful debate, and it all fell apart very quickly. I don't take any pleasure in that, because I don't think it was edifying for that country. But at least we have to recognise that in our system, first of all, sir, if I may say, even though we have an unusual way for selecting our president, who is effectively our speaker, it's not up to the speaker to decide which amendments, once they've been lodged, can be heard and which can't be heard. It's not up to the speaker to decide whether a member gets to speak. He may choose the order in which they speak, but that's by the lights that come on. And we know that actually in this debate, every voice that wants to be heard can be heard, and every amendment that wants to be tabled and lodged will be tabled and lodged and considered. And I think in that we do ourselves hopefully proud as an assembly. But whilst we're talking about the wording of this proposition, I want members to know that I did spend a great deal of time thinking about how, and indeed whether to bring this proposition, and then what the wording of the proposition should be. So I turn to part B, because that's, I think, is the first part where there may be some, well, that we need to establish consensus on. Hopefully there is some consensus already. Part B calls for a ceasefire. I must admit, when I first started drafting this, I did use different words. I said, let's have a cessation of hostilities. And I gradually talked to different people around the issue, and they said, well, there is a word for that. It's called a ceasefire. And that's why I think countries around the world are using the term ceasefire. And I don't think it should be seen as a radical stance, hopefully in 2024, to point out that a ceasefire is not only desirable, but in this case, it's vital if the killing and the harm that we talked about in part A is to stop, and if long-term peace is to have any chance whatsoever. But it also talks about things that need to happen. So it's not just about a ceasefire. And I do want to raise at this point that I've heard people say a ceasefire is no good because Hamas won't respect a ceasefire. The whole point of a ceasefire is that it can't be a ceasefire unless both parties agree to it and adhere to it. So I think there should be that understanding that in calling for a ceasefire, there's an assumption and a definition that means that it must be adhered to and that hostilities must stop. But there's also a reference, and I think it's important that this reference is here, to the taking of hostages, because what we saw on the 7th of October is already being condemned, and it needs to be condemned again, because in my view, the taking of hostages is a particularly nasty practice, especially when some of these hostages are vulnerable people and those who happen to just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But sadly, and it's not just in this conflict, but there has been a long-standing practice of hostage and prisoner trading, where humans are used as pawns in a bigger, more violent game. And at this point, I add the word of warning that there is wrongdoing on both sides. I won't go into detail because I see that there's little to be gained from reading out a list of alleged abuse that has occurred or does routinely occur on either side. But we know that there has historically, and there is still an issue ongoing and serious questions to be answered about the detention of child prisoners in the region. And this has been an issue that's been flagged up by charities in the region. I'll simply add that according to a Save the Children paper, it is estimated that there were between 500 and 1,000 children held in military detention in Israel each year. And I bring us back to the UNCRC. That Article 37 writes that no child shall be deprived of his or her liberty unlawfully or arbitrarily, and that arrest, detention or imprisonment of a child shall be in conformity with the law and shall be used only as a measure of last resort for the shortest appropriate period of time. But we know that there are children on both sides. Our heart goes out in particular, I think, to the child hostages that have been taken. Now, turning to Part C, I think this is hopefully also clear, but I think it does need some attention. Because, of course, we will be looking at amendments later on, and whilst I'm not using this speech to talk about against the amendments, I do it to speak for my proposition and say that actually there are certain words that I've put in there deliberately. There are certain words which are being removed by the Minister, and there are certain words that are being substituted for them. So Part C, again, is quite, I think, straightforward. That international law should be adhered to in order to stop further significant loss of lives and to avoid potential acts of genocide. And I think we can break that down into two parts. I think the first part, well, in fact, I think all of it should be uncontroversial, but I know that the first part is probably the least controversial amongst members. So that international law should be adhered to in order to stop further significant loss of civilian lives. I hope that's not controversial. But we, of course, come to the potential acts of genocide. I hope that we all as an assembly want the avoidance of potential acts of genocide in the region. If we don't, I would find that very strange. But also that wording hasn't been plucked out of thin air. And we'll look at that in a moment. Those are the words of the International Court of Justice. That's a body which has been set up, rejigged, in fact, reconstituted after the horrors of the Second World War in, I think it was 1948, to make sure that atrocities didn't happen again and that, in fact, countries and powers were held to account if and when those atrocities did occur. And, of course, one of those international conventions is the Convention on Genocide, which has obligations on all member states, not simply not to commit genocide, but not to stand by whilst acts of genocide may be happening. Again, the words of I was going to say the Royal Court there, sir, but the International Court of Justice, sir, which does talk about that. And what I want to do is, at this point, perhaps introduce a different interlocutor, because sometimes in all the emails that we get from members lobbying us one way or the other, members of the public lobbying us, you get that email which really stands out, that somebody's put a particular amount of thought into and comes at it from a completely different angle and actually brings the troubles, if we can call them that, which are quite far away in some ways. They're beamed to us on the radio and on the TV, but sometimes they can seem quite far away and we can seem removed from them. That said, I know that there are members in our Assembly for whom they are very close. And so if you don't mind, sir, I'll read a letter from one of the women who contacted us from the public. Even though she's well known to this Assembly, and even though she said she would be quite happy for me to name her, I think I won't, sir, because of standing orders. But members will have worked with her, especially the older ones, in different capacity. I say the older ones, I put my hand up too. Imagine, if you will, a very different life in Jersey, where there are 420,000 inhabitants living across the island. There's no way in or out of the island without the consent of another nation, and none is given, and there's no food, no water, no medication coming in. Then one day, all those living in the west of the island are told they have to move to the east of the island for their own safety, old, young, healthy, or sick, with or without transport. The west is then bombarded. All the schools, churches, the many residences, health facilities, desalination plant, farms are lost. You resettle in the east with the little that you could carry, many people to a room or in tents, and then you were all told to move again to St. Helier, where you will be safe. The east is then bombed, and you are traumatized. The hospital is attacked, there's no electricity, operations are carried out without anesthetic, vinegar is used to sterilize wounds. Women and children are particularly hard hit in all of the bombing, as the men allow them to occupy the overcrowded dwellings whilst they sleep outside and buildings are targeted. Women give birth and even have caesarean sections without anaesthetic. Children are terrified. Whole families are killed. People are dying all the time. You can't collect your relatives' bodies because of the danger, and you can't see what the future holds, and you are so hungry that there is no food, and even babies start to die of malnutrition. Is it reasonable to seek a ceasefire in such a situation? Is it reasonable to say enough is enough? Our attackers must stop now. And by the way, they're going to start bombing St. Helier next week. She goes on to say, I don't pretend to understand why Hamas did what they did. And I certainly don't understand how killing more than 25 times the number that were initially killed can be an appropriate response. She says, this isn't an act of self-defense. This is surely a genocide. And if you would not accept this behavior towards your home or a country near you, neither should you accept it elsewhere. I'll leave that there. It does go on a little bit longer. Now, there are members in our society who think that what's happening at the moment does constitute a genocide. I, as a parliamentarian, would be very careful about using that kind of language because, of course, what we know, and this is where it becomes difficult because we've heard different interlocutors over the last few weeks. And whilst it's been really useful to hear those different voices, but when some of the arguments are put forward that this can't be a genocide, and I'm paraphrasing, because there aren't enough people being killed. And that's the message that I've effectively heard. That's how I've heard it. There aren't enough people being killed for this to be a genocide. We have to bring it back to the fact that, first of all, we don't decide on if or when genocide is being committed. There has to be an independent arbiter, and the test of what constitutes genocide is not the magnitude of the acts that are taking place, but the intent. And of course, there is a legal definition for that. And when we look at the statistics, and I personally look at the UN statistics and the UN website, and the tally at the moment it's gone up from since when that constituent of all of us wrote to us, and it's the death toll is estimated at 29,000. And I know we can get into arguments about those figures. Well, how did those figures come about? How do you know that they're all civilians? How do you know that they're not combatants? And of course, we also remember the 1,200 plus Israelis and the hostages who are still being held. And we remember the thousands more who have been injured. We remember that the children who have been orphaned. And we know that there's a whole generation of children who will be growing up without parents, without family to look after. And one can only think about what will happen to them, especially when we, as an island, take the rights of the child so seriously. And then, yet this is such a dramatic departure from anything that we could rightly imagine. And that's before you even get to the infrastructure and the desolation that's being created in this small strip of land. And that can't be good for people in Gaza or living in Israel. I can't see how any of this spiritually, emotionally can be good for anyone unless that pause and that ceasefire comes, sir. So let's look at what the ICJ said. I think it's important that we do leave the reference to the ICJ in there, and we also contextualise it. That the ICJ have given a ruling, not in a void or a vacuum. They've done it because a case was brought to them by a member country, and that country was South Africa. We don't need to remove that reference. I'm sorry if I'm talking to the amendment, but I'm saying why I put this there in the first place. Let's not try and whitewash anything here. Just let's be factual about what's happened. If we want to get away from he said, she said, or they said, and they said, let's stick to the facts. The facts are that a case has been brought by South Africa because they believe that what's happening in the region may constitute genocide. By way of a note, I think South Africa have a particular sensitivity to these issues, of course, because of their history. They've lived through a system of apartheid, and they've come through that system of apartheid. And by all means, I'm not saying that everything is rosy in South Africa, but we know as a valued member of our Commonwealth community that they have some experience in what they're talking about here. So what did the ICJ say? Well, the court ordered Israel to refrain from any acts that could fall under the Genocide Convention and to ensure that its troops committed no genocidal acts in Gaza. They ruled that it was plausible that what was happening in Gaza may constitute genocide. And that in itself, I think, is sufficient for us to really stand up and listen. But more importantly, and this is where we're going with this debate, it's important that the UK listens to that. Because Jersey doesn't have sovereignty in these issues, but we do have a voice as an assembly. And when we see the UK and the USA prevaricating in this issue, and to the point where they can't even get a position on what should be a relatively simple proposal for a ceasefire, I think it's right that we in Jersey stand up and say, well, hang on a minute, the UK doesn't legislate for us, but they don't make policy for us either. How many times have we been told that they can't do that for us? And so I think it's absolutely right. If our position as an assembly happens to coincidentally be aligned with what the UK's position is, which I find difficult because the UK doesn't have a position at the moment. They haven't actually taken that final stance that they can get behind, I don't think. But if it happens to be aligned, that's fine. But I, for one, am not convinced that the UK position is the correct one to take. So I think I'm going to draw this proposition to a close and make the proposition. But I want to leave members with some further thoughts. I'm not going to address in detail Part E because I've circulated information about what is meant by the occupied Palestinian territories. That is simply factual. It's the internationally recognised position that there are territories, Palestinian territories, which have been occupied since 1967 in the region, and that actually that's a part of the wider problem. So this problem didn't start on the 7th of October last year. This is an ongoing conflict. And the point is, if we simply leave it, if the international community leaves it to the two sides to fight out, we're simply going to get more hatred, because hatred begets hatred, violence begets more violence, and this issue won't be moved on. So I think we need to bring this back to position of hope, and just before the lunch break, Deputy Gorse won't mind me saying this, but I think I've taken my jacket off, and members won't be able to see, although they will if I do this. But I've got a nice pattern. This is the shame about men get to wear these beautiful suits being parliamentarians. And all of the lovely stitchings, not in your case, sir, you get to wear your magnificent robes on the outside, we can see them, but often some of the best stitching and best linings, of course, on the inside, and I know Deputy Ferry's showing me his now. It's a show and tell, sir, I think. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's what you might call Paisley. It's a reference. And I said to Deputy Gorse, I said, I'm going to make a reference to Paisley in my summing up, but not the pattern. I'm going to talk to you about Ian Paisley, and I'm also going to talk to you about Martin McGuinness. Because I was reading an article, I can't remember where it was, I think it was in Time online, and that they were saying about, it wasn't Time, it was Atlantic it was called, and they said how remarkable it was that even 25 years ago, the idea of these two men, even just sitting in a room, talking to each other about a possible peace process would have been unthinkable. Everyone would have laughed at you. And the article made the point about how this strange friendship has sprung up between these two individuals. And it's partly the election to Bipper, which made me think about that as well this morning. And I think it's in these times that you have to still cling on to that hope. Where is the hope in that scenario? Because it's not a perfect parallel to make, it's not a perfect analogy, but there are, of course, many similarities that one could legitimately draw between the troubles that we've seen in Ireland, both because they had a very real present-day implication. There was that fear and there was that fighting that took place, but there was also a historical context that needed to be addressed. And I think at the moment we have a lot of the attention is focusing on quite rightly, on the immediate issues. We need to get people to lay down their arms and to engage in talking, but how do you get people to talk when they can't be sitting in the same room as each other? So I think this is the thing that we need to grapple with, but we also need, as an international community, to facilitate those conversations. And I'm realistic. I know that as a small island in Jersey, we won't be facilitating that. But I think as a small and hopefully unified island, when it comes to the big ticket items, that we can speak with one voice and say that we are a peace-loving island. We do know what it's like to have had conflict in our community. We do know what it's like to have had an occupation in our community, and we also know what it's like to have moved beyond that. And so, sir, I do make the proposition, sir. I'm sorry to members if I've missed anything out that they think that I should have addressed, but of course there is an opportunity for eventually a summing up on some proposition or another, I make the proposition, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the proposition seconded?